Hi everybody, thank you for joining me for the final time in this series as I conclude my examination of Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict from my atheist perspective. In this video, I will cover the final three chapters of the book, chapters 38 through 40, plus just a little tiny bit of concluding material tacked on at the end, and then we'll be done. So since the sooner we get started, the sooner we'll be done, let's get started. Chapter 38, Certainty versus Certitude. McDowell begins the chapter by explaining that we have different degrees of certainty depending on what kind of truth we are trying to be certain about, and that we can have what is called moral or practical certainty about the truths of Christianity. And moral and practical certainty are two different types of certainty, but they're very closely related. And he goes on to describe four types of natural certainty in the next few paragraphs of the chapter. So first he begins by describing logical certainty. Logical certainty is certainty about the truth of a mathematical or logical principle. Something is logically certain if there is no logical possibility that it can be false. And an example of a logically certain statement would be something like 2 plus 2 equals 4, or all circles are round. These are things that cannot possibly be false, because to state them otherwise would be a contradiction. They have to be true. After logical certainty, there is metaphysical certainty. And this is certainty about something that doesn't qualify as a statement of pure logic, like a mathematical statement or a logical statement. It refers to something in reality, but it is nonetheless an undeniably true statement. For example, I exist. The statement I exist must be true, because if I did not exist, then I would not be here to make any sort of a statement at all. So that has to be true. Then there is moral certainty. And moral certainty is certainty about something that could hypothetically, logically be false. It doesn't have to be true, like the certainties in the previous two types of certainty. But there is so much evidence for it that there is no reason to not believe it. This is certainty beyond a reasonable doubt. Something that doesn't have to be true, but nonetheless is almost certainly true. There's no reason to think it isn't. And then finally, there is practical certainty, which is sort of a level below moral certainty. It's not quite as certain as moral certainty, but you call that you say that you have practical certainty about something that you believe that has a very, very high probability of being true. For example, you would be practically certain of what you had for breakfast this morning. Now, it's possible that you aren't remembering your breakfast correctly. It's possible that your memory or your perception of your breakfast has been altered or affected somehow to make it inaccurate. But barring any evidence for that, it's extremely unlikely that that is the case. You can be practically certain that you had cornflakes for breakfast or whatever you had for breakfast. So that's it for chapter 38. It was just a very brief sort of descriptive chapter. And again, as I mentioned a few times, I think that there is sort of a superstitious attachment to the number 40 because of the 40 days in the wilderness, the 40 years of wandering in the desert, the 40 days of fasting. I think McDowell really wanted this edition of the book to have 40 chapters, so he throws in a couple of those little short ones that could probably be very easily folded into a larger chapter and work just fine. But that's chapter 38. Now chapter 39, Defending Miracles. McDowell gets right down to business in this chapter, declaring that if a theistic God exists, then miracles are possible. Miracles, he reminds us, are being defined here in this book as special acts of God. And McDowell takes care to note that the Bible is not being used to confirm the possibility of miracles, but only to report certain miraculous events that took place in history. And furthermore, McDowell asserts that we infer that miracles can take place from the fact that we live in a theistic universe. And we don't conclude that miracles take place from the Bible, since the Bible doesn't argue for the existence of God or for the existence of miracles, but merely presupposes God and reports on the occurrence of miracles throughout its supposed history. So the Bible presupposes the existence of God, but the obvious question that springs right to my mind is, why should we presuppose the existence of God, or we don't even need to presuppose. Why should we share the Bible's belief in the existence of God? Well, to prove the existence of God, McDowell is relying on the non-biblical classical arguments for the existence of God, like the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, etc. Basically, William Lane Craig's standard opening act. And this allows him to avoid making a blatantly circular argument for his belief in God, because technically speaking, he's not basing his belief in the existence of God on the Bible. He's saying, I bring that to the Bible already because I know God exists from these other arguments. And this allows him to escape that circular argument, but there's still the problem of how you get from the generic God of the first cause that follows from acceptance of the cosmological argument to the personal and particular God of the Bible. And to get to that God, you have to simply accept his existence on the authority of the Bible. And that is still circular. The evidence for the existence of the God of the Bible is nowhere other than the Bible. You can get, even if you accept the philosophical arguments for the existence of God, that doesn't get you the biblical God. You still have to accept the authority of the Bible to get the biblical God. So it still is, practically speaking, a circular argument to get to where McDowell is and his acceptance of the Christian God or the biblical God. So, next section of this chapter is titled The Nature of Miracles. So what are the attributes of miracles? What makes something a miracle as opposed to just an astonishing natural occurrence? This is one of my problems, as I've spoken about previous chapters of this book. How can you tell a genuine miracle from a natural event that merely appears to be a miracle? I have argued previously that this is an unfalsifiable definition of a miracle, but McDowell gives me reason to doubt that in this section because he lists a few distinguishing features of miracles. For instance, miracles are supernatural acts of God. Well, that's not really very much help. Miracles do not violate natural laws. Now, this is interesting. This one might strike some as a little contradictory, coming after the first one. The first one being miracles are supernatural acts of God, and then miracles do not violate natural laws. Well, how can something be supernatural and not violate natural laws? Well, McDowell explains it this way. He says that miracles are caused by God acting from outside our system of natural laws, and that's what makes them supernatural. So by this definition, anything God does cannot violate our natural laws because God isn't beholden to our natural laws. He doesn't break our laws. He simply just reaches in and makes things happen. He's not violating our natural order. A miracle then would be an action that is possible for God alone to perform. God can make this miracle happen, but we here in the natural world, under the jurisdiction of the natural laws, we cannot replicate that action. We can't make the miracle happen ourselves. Only God can. So I want future generations of humanity to keep this in mind when future medicine and science find ways of spontaneously creating life, reversing physical death, or transmuting water into wine, that will prove that the miracles of Jesus weren't miracles at all, even if they actually happened. So keep that in mind, future people. Miracles are immediate. This is the next attribute. Miracles don't just slowly progress from one stage to the next. They are instantaneous. And finally, miracles are always successful. No such thing as a failed miracle. Next section, the purpose of miracles. McDowell lists and briefly describes 5 purposes of miracles. The first 2 are very closely linked together, so I'm going to handle them as a pair. They are miracles can confirm a message from God, and miracles can confirm a messenger of God. And these 2 suffer from the same problem. If God worked miracles to confirm his message and messengers, why did he stop working miracles thousands of years ago? Even if we assume that the miracles really took place, if we trust the history of the New Testament, let's just say, it's only the people who actually witnessed the miracles who received confirmation that the related message or messenger was from God. They got miracles to confirm those things. But thousands of years later, I don't have miracles. Even if we assume for the sake of argument that those miracles actually took place. Here today, I don't have miraculous confirmation. of the Bible, of Jesus, of the message of God. I have ancient writings recording claims of miracles. God hasn't miraculously confirmed anything to me or anyone else who has been alive since the last apostle performed the last miracle. Which makes me wonder why God bothered with the miraculous confirmation of his messages and messengers at all, knowing in his omniscience that the vast majority of people who would have to accept Christ to gain their salvation would have to do so without any miraculous justification of the Bible or of the people who wrote it. We don't get miracles. We get thousands of years old writings about miracles. So the confirmation argument doesn't hold water for me. The next purpose, miracles promote good alone, because miracles are from God. And God is good, see? And God don't do evil miracles. At least not by God's own definition. Miracles glorify God alone, because God is an egomaniac, you see? And God don't glorify nobody but God. Aren't double negatives fun? Miracles form the framework of Christianity. Miracles are an indispensable part of Christianity because they form the bases of crucial Christian doctrines, and because they serve to demonstrate the truth of Christianity, because they are visible to believers and non-believers alike, or at least they were thousands of years ago the last time they happened. And finally, miracles differ from magic. Now this is listed with the purposes of miracles, but I think it would fit better with the previous list of distinguishing attributes of miracles, because it doesn't really have anything to say about any more of the purposes of miracles. It just differentiates between miracles and magic. And the main difference between miracles and magic, McDowell says, is that miracles are under God's control, not man's control. Also, miracles don't involve deception and are not naturally repeatable. And the most noteworthy thing about this little section to me is that McDowell never denies that magic is a real thing, merely that it produces false miracles. So add that to your list of preposterous shit that Christians believe, if it's not there already, which it probably is. After all, if magic didn't really exist, fundamentalist parents would have no logical reason for banning their children from reading Harry Potter books. Next section, answering objections to miracles. McDowell responds to objections to miracles raised by Spinoza, Hume, and Patrick Noel Smith. First, Spinoza. Spinoza rejected the notion of miracles because to him, nature and God are the same thing. God is all and all is God. And since the natural order is a part of God, it would be absurd under Spinoza's definition to claim that a violation of that order would be possible. Therefore, there are no miracles. Well, McDowell responds to this by restating his position that miracles are not violations of natural law, but merely events introduced by a cause that sits outside of that natural realm. What McDowell doesn't do is provide any reason why his definition of miracles as events originating from outside the natural order that don't actually violate the natural order is more acceptable than Spinoza's. Practically speaking, all he does is present an alternative definition of the word. He says, well, that's not what miracles are, this is what miracles are, but he never gives us any reason why we should accept that this is what miracles are. Next, McDowell moves on to David Hume, who rejects miracles on grounds of incredulity. Since natural events are far more common and better established than miracles, it is never preferable to assume that a given event is a miracle instead of an event with some natural explanation. The response to this, quoted from C.S. Lewis, is that since Hume cannot know that every reported miracle is false, it is only his own biased presupposition that compels him to reject that miracles occur. Now, I've been over this more times than I can remember in this series alone. Naturalism, what McDowell absurdly refers to as anti-supernaturalism, is not a presupposition. It's a conclusion drawn from experience. Naturalism is not axiomatic. If McDowell or C.S. Lewis or anyone else wants me to accept the occurrence of miracles, all they have to do is convince me that a single miracle has ever taken place. convince me that one miracle has ever happened, and you will have proven the concept, and I will accept that miracles are possible, that miracles can occur. It strikes me that this argument can be boiled down to David Hume isn't credulous enough. And if I were David Hume, I wouldn't find that too insulting. McDowell then quotes Ronald Nash, who accuses Hume of ignoring indirect evidence for miracles. For instance, you may not witness the miraculous healing of a blind man yourself, but you can still believe that the miracle took place based on the fact that this formerly blind man can now see. Well, the flaw in this argument is obvious. If you didn't witness the miraculous healing yourself, but rather saw a blind man and then saw the same man again sometime later, no longer blind, it's far more reasonable to assume that the man's blindness was cured through some natural medical means than through a miracle. Finally, McDowell argues against Patrick Noel Smith's argument that so-called miracles are actually just natural events for which we don't yet know the explanation. Quote, Noel Smith's objection to miracles is rooted in a kind of naturalistic faith, not scientific evidence. And that faith would perhaps be based on the fact that there is not a single confirmed, documented miracle in all of human history, and would therefore be very different from the religious faith a Christian has in the truth of the Bible. The reason scientists are trained to look for natural explanations and not to take supernatural claims at face value is that so far, every single phenomenon that has ever been explained has been explained naturally. How many rocks do you have to turn over without finding fairies before you finally conclude there is no such thing as fairies? McDowell also takes issue with Noel Smith's claim that miracles should be rejected because they lack explanatory and predictive power. McDowell's argument, quoted from Norman Pythagoras Geisler, the great philosopher of our time, is that lots of other events lack predictive value as well, such as when a bachelor gets married. But we still accept that such events take place. The problem with this is that a bachelor getting married, or any other event that Geisler and McDowell might describe as lacking predictive value, is a natural event with a natural explanation. The problem with miracles is that God did it isn't an explanation for anything. It doesn't help us understand the how and the why and the what of that occurrence any more than we did before. Calling something a miracle doesn't explain anything about it except in the most generic sense. And science isn't in the business of superficial, inadequate explanations. Science seeks to understand the world at the deepest, most fundamental level we can access. And finally, chapter 40, is history knowable? McDowell opens the chapter with this, quote, there is no doubt that much of the evidence for the validity of the Christian faith is rooted in history. Christianity is a historically founded faith. McDowell and William Lane Craig and Norman Geisler, whom he quotes extensively in this chapter, they all go on to describe the importance of history to the Christian faith, and how, because Christianity is firmly rooted in history, we can use historical evidence to verify its truth. And to that I say, great. Where's the evidence? Show me the historical evidence so we can talk about it. It's the final chapter of this book titled Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And I'll be damned if I can remember a single word of it that has anything to do with actual evidence for its claims. And you guys who've been watching this series, and especially those of you who've been masochistic enough to be reading along with me as I go, tell me, and be honest, have I missed anything? Did I skip over the part where he talked about the evidence? Does Josh McDowell describe a single piece of what he calls evidence that is not either the Bible or someone writing about the Bible? Because I don't remember that. When he's done describing just how incredibly important history is to Christianity, McDowell turns to his final task of the book, taking on the argument that history is unknowable. Because if you think you can deny Christianity by denying that we can know things about history, you've got another thing coming. And this is similar of course, to how McDowell spent so much time arguing for the knowability of truth, as though it were necessary to deny the very concept of truth in order to avoid accepting the claims of Christianity. Similarly, I suppose in order to deny the history on which Christianity claims to base itself, we must deny that history itself can ever be known. As with the arguments about truth, I know of no atheist or critic of Christianity who doubts the Bible or the divinity of Jesus on this basis. If anything, the knowability of history is a very good reason for not accepting Christianity. We can know things about history, and therefore we can know that many of the events that supposedly form the historical foundation of Christianity never actually happened. McDowell spends the rest of the chapter arguing for the knowability of history, which I don't object to, and also for the knowability of miracles in history, which I also don't object to in principle. If miracles occurred in history, we ought to be able to know that they occurred. Unfortunately, but not unexpectedly, his defense of the historicity of miracles amounts to an extended reiteration of his earlier defense of the general acceptance of miracles. We can't prove that they didn't happen, therefore we should accept that they did happen, at least the ones that we read about in the Bible. Then he starts wrapping things up. Quote, "I would like to conclude this section, as well as this book, with a word not from my head, but from my heart. Much of the material you've read has been pretty heady stuff. And that's good. God gave us minds to use to evaluate the evidence of His revelation of Himself to us, and also to imagine that evidence when it doesn't actually exist, apparently." McDowell goes on, quote, "But much more often in the Bible, God speaks on a heart-to-heart level, and that's my attitude as I close this book. If you or someone you know is struggling with the issue of giving your life to Christ, I'm imagining myself sitting across the table from you talking heart to heart. Perhaps you're struggling with some of the issues mentioned in this chapter. You may be saying, 'I've never seen a miracle. How can I put my faith in a message that speaks of the miraculous?' Josh McDowell, get out of my head!" He goes on, quote, "As we saw earlier in this chapter, David Hume and many other philosophers and educators throughout history have adopted the position that miracles are impossible, partially on the basis that it is much more probable that miracles don't occur than they do occur." He really does have a hard-on for David Hume, doesn't he? Continuing, quote, "But though it may be more probable that miracles do not occur, it is foolish to rule out the possibility of the miraculous simply because of probability. And as we saw in the section on prophecy fulfilled in Jesus, the probability of any one person in history fulfilling all those nearly 300 prophecies was literally next to impossible. And yet, the historical records tell us that against all odds, Jesus came and did just that." And by historical records, he can only mean the Bible. The only evidence McDowell has written about in this book is the Bible. As I've stated previously in the series, there is something undeniably impressive about the way McDowell writes this book. The audacity of writing a book titled Evidence That Demands a Verdict that never so much as even refers to actual evidence is remarkable, if not admirable. The misdirection that McDowell carries out for nearly 700 pages with total commitment and delusional confidence, never blinking, is absolutely something to behold. Now, before I wrap up, there's a section right at the very back of the book taken from a tract written by Bill Bright called The Four Spiritual Laws. And the four spiritual laws are, 1, God loves you and offers a wonderful plan for your life. Man is sinful and separated from God, therefore he cannot know and experience God's love and plan for his life. Jesus Christ is God's only provision for man's sin. Through him you can know and experience God's love and plan for your life. And we must individually receive Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord. then we can know and experience God's love and plan for our lives. And needless to say, all four of those are backed up by biblical passages. So in the end, we're left with the Bible. That's the only thing that McDowell presents as evidence. And the fundamental flaw of that argument, the great big fault line from which all the other smaller cracks branch off, and there are a bunch of them, is that the Bible isn't evidence of anything other than the beliefs of the people who wrote it. The Bible tells us that people believed Jesus worked miracles and rose from the dead, or at least that they wanted other people to believe that. It doesn't give us any reason to believe those things ourselves. An anonymous report that a miracle took place isn't evidence that a miracle took place, especially if that report is over 2,000 years old and the person who supposedly worked the miracle is worshipped as a god by the person who made the report. If you've watched this series, and especially if you've read the book along with me, you've seen Josh McDowell twist and abuse the methods of scientific inquiry, relentlessly project his own biases onto his adversaries, redefine atheism to suit his own purposes, disparage higher education, mischaracterize and deride skepticism, express incredulity at firmly established scientific principles like evolution, while recommending the often preposterous claims of the Bible be taken at face value, and that the Bible be accepted as a reliable source of historical and moral truth on its own authority. As McDowell himself wrote near the end of the book's third section, now the verdict must be delivered. It's not the verdict McDowell wants us to reach, but it is the verdict toward which I am propelled by reason, science, history, and my own desire to know the truth, whatever it may be. The charges are as follows: that Josh McDowell is a mendacious, disreputable modern apologist, and that the Bible is a book of myths, not a book of facts. And the verdict is guilty on both counts. That is it for evidence that demands a verdict. I'm done. We're all done. Thank you so much, as always, for watching this. And as I close out this series, I want to make a recommendation to you. The reason I do this series, the reason I do all of these apologetic series, is because I feel like it's a valuable thing to offer non-Christian responses to Christian apologetics and Christian evangelism, so that those of you who are not Christians, who are approached by Christians, by well-meaning friends or family members or people you encounter on the internet or whatever, and they make these Christian arguments to you that you may not have thought about on your own, that it gives you some basis of forming your own responses. So you know what I think as an atheist. Now maybe that will help you figure out what you think and articulate your own response and your own opinion as an atheist, and will help you understand why a particular Christian argument is wrong, instead of just, as a lot of people have told me, and as I used to feel sometimes myself, I can't put my finger on it, but I just know that that's not right. I hope that this has been a help for you in those areas. And a lot of people leave comments and say, oh, Steve is reading this stuff so we don't have to. And I love that, and I really appreciate that sentiment. And those of you who are watching these series for that reason, which I get the feeling is most of you, that is awesome. But if you have the stomach for it, if you have the sand, I would recommend that you read one of these books yourselves on your own. It can be one of the books I've already done a series for. It can be one of the books I haven't talked about yet. But pick up a book of Christian apologetics and read it. Or the next time that a family member or a friend or an acquaintance hands you a copy of a Josh McDowell book, a Lee Strobel book, whatever, read it. Read it. It might be tough. Believe me, this was not fun to read. This was not a fun thing to read at all. None of the books I have done have been fun to read. The closest was Mere Christianity, because it at least was competently written. But none of them have been a pleasure to read for me. But it was good for me to read them. It was good for me to understand the reasoning and the arguments of people who disagree with me, so I can better understand why they think the things they think, and I can better understand why I think the things that I think that disagree with what they think. That's important. It's important to know the arguments of people against your position. So I would recommend that you read a book like that yourself. It's important, at least if you care about this. If you don't care about the conversation, if you don't care about the debate, the argument between theism and atheism, that's fine. You don't have to. But if it's something that you're interested in, and it's something that compels you, and it's something that you enjoy talking about with people, both atheist and religious, and everywhere in between, it's something that you should do occasionally. Pick up a book of apologetics, read what it says, figure out what you think about it on your own. That's very, very important. And it's something that I highly, highly recommend to everybody. And those of you who are watching this, who are Christians, I know there are a few Christians who watch these series, and you guys, you leave comments or you PM me or email me, and I think that's awesome. Read a book by an atheist, if you haven't already. I don't mean to be presumptuous and assume that you haven't, but if you haven't, read a book by Richard Dawkins. Read a book by Christopher Hitchens. Read a book by Sam Harris or Daniel Dennett. Read a book by Bertrand Russell. Read The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine. Read some of the works of Robert Ingersoll. Learn why we think the things we think. Read some popular science if you haven't read it before. Learn about the scientific, secular, non-religious explanations for things, and maybe get a taste of why we think those are so much more satisfying than religious explanations. So anyway, that would be my recommendation. I'm going to be doing this again starting in January. For those of you who are watching these as I upload them, I'm going to take the rest of this year off and then start again in January with a new book. But for now, the evidence is in. The verdict is guilty on all counts. And I'm done doing this for a while. So those of you who enjoy these series, thank you so much. I'll be back to do this again starting in January. Please feel free to leave comments, questions, suggestions, arguments, agreements, whatever, on this video or any of the other videos. I truly, truly appreciate that you have been attentive to this, that you have found some use from this and some value to this. You don't know how much it means to me, and you don't know how much of a pleasure it is, even with the crappy books. You don't know how much of a pleasure it is for me to do this, both for myself and for you guys. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.